Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that America overnight will suddenly decide to put boots on the ground. But if President Trump is serious that he wants to bring this war to an end, his first attempt seems to be to try to use carrots, to encourage both sides to talk, to try to incentivize President Putin. One of the things that he did, he listened to what President Putin had said about the expansion of NATO, and President Trump told President Putin, I take NATO off the table. Ukraine will not be able to join NATO. What else do you want? All of a sudden, then Trump was probably told, well, I want to keep this land bridge down to Crimea. President Trump, it appears, has said, yep, Ukraine will have to cede territory. What else is it you want? All of which was, it seems, an effort to find a way of finding out what Putin would need to have on the table to bring the war to an end. What President Putin has failed to do is actually tell Trump what he needs. And I suspect, therefore, what Trump has, he claims he's the master of a deal. You can try being the nice guy, which is what he's tried to do so far. The next approach is to be the bad guy. If you're not going to do this the nice way, then I'm going to try a different approach. And one of those approaches that President Trump might consider is to get involved militarily, because he knows that Russia would have no answer to that. And therefore, that is something that President Putin will almost certainly be trying to avoid.
Also, US Vice President J.D. Vance says that Russia is asking too much in negotiations over ceasefire deal in Ukraine. Do you feel that Trump's administration is starting to realize that Vladimir Putin is not really interested, is not ready to make any kind of compromise?
Well, I think what's interesting is you talk about the Trump administration, but the previous models of the United States administration, you would have a president who was the titular head, but his think tank would be all his policy folks that would all sit around, debate, have different views, but would finally align around an agreed line on behalf of America. The model today seems very different. It feels like President Trump is simply making all the decisions, and his cabinet are waiting to hear what he says and then supporting it. And therefore, it feels like for the first 100 days, his cabinet was purely turning around and mirroring what President Trump was saying, which was, we're looking for peace. We need to find the best way of peace, and actually all sides want peace. Now he's not been successful. I think it's no surprise that we're hearing his administration start to talk about problems, where the problems lie, and ultimately some of the language disturbingly sounds like America just wants to disconnect from that conversation. And I think that's what Europe is worried about, because Ukraine has found it difficult enough to withstand Russian onslaught with the support of the Americans. If the American support was to reduce or even to disappear altogether, that would be very difficult for Europe to step up and fill the gap. And that's why so many efforts are going on behind the scenes to try to maintain American commitment and support, which is why this minerals deal was so important as well.
You just mentioned about the possibility of the US government walking away from negotiations and supporting Ukraine. Would this be a good or bad option for Vladimir Putin? Because some military experts believe that if the US withdraws from negotiations, then Vladimir Putin will have even more problems, because in such case, Europe will lead negotiations with Russia and support for Ukraine, and Europe knows who is the aggressor in this war.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I am much more focused on the military side of this campaign and less on the politics side. I do appreciate that gives me a certain perspective on it. At the moment, in purely military terms, although America and Europe provide a similar amount of financial support to Ukraine, it's America's vast stockpiles of weapons and much more impressive defense industrial base that is generating by far and away more weapons support for Ukraine. And that's what your nation needs at the moment. My worry is, therefore, that if America walks away, that all of a sudden, in the near term, Europe will find it incredibly difficult to match the weapons supply that's currently coming from America. And that means, from a military perspective, Vladimir Putin's forces on the ground would have an easier time. It will be the time I'd be telling them, push and push harder. You could be right that diplomatically, politically, that Europe would be less easy to negotiate with for Vladimir Putin. But bluntly, he's only launched this military campaign to achieve military objectives. Until those are achieved, I don't see any reason for him actually negotiating. And for the time being, therefore, I'd fully expect Putin to keep pushing and actually breathe a sigh of relief if America starts to disengage. That will be the answer to Putin's prayers.
And if Vladimir Putin decides to move forward with his war, but if he really wouldn't be able to reach all the military objectives, his military objectives, for a while, because it seems a little bit unrealistic for Russia to cross, for example, Dnipro River, capture the city of Kherson, the city of Zaporizhia. Vladimir Putin thinks that those cities are Russian but they are Ukrainian. If he cannot achieve his objectives for a while, for months, for years, would he seek a ceasefire deal? Will he agree with a ceasefire deal in the long-term perspective?
Well, again, Daniel, my belief is, looking at history, is that the Russian forces today will not be able to cross the Dnipro River anytime soon. And therefore, they will need a period of rest. They will need to rebuild. They will need to replace their main battle tanks, their artillery shells. They will need to repair the wounded. They will need to create new supply lines. And they will need that. That will probably take a few years. But the worry here is that Russia has done it once. They have had an extremely difficult time. They probably expected to subjugate the whole of Ukraine within days back in February of 2022. But they will have learnt their lesson. They would come back stronger. The whole Russian defense industrial base is now on a war footing. And therefore, within a matter of a few years, Russia will be ready for this next big push. They would know how to get across the Dnipro River. And unless Ukraine was very well prepared, that would probably signify the start of the next phase of battle. So for me, what's key here is that Russia will eventually grind to a halt. For now, the challenge, of course, then is, how on earth does Ukraine secure the security guarantees it needs to make sure that Russia cannot do that next push forward? And that won't be something that Ukraine can do alone. I suspect that is something that ideally NATO would have provided, but it looks unlikely that NATO will be the answer. So what are the elements of that security that needs to be in place? Not just a signature on a bit of paper, but actual credible deterrence that will stop Russia from coming again in a few years' time.
Let's also cover recent developments in the assassination campaign inside Russia. Recently, Russian General Yaroslav Moskalik has been killed in car bomb attack near Moscow. And last year, in December last year, another Russian general, Igor Kirillov, was killed in the bomb attack. How do you see the main consequences of this attack on Vladimir Putin's chain of command and his army? And how do you see the psychological consequences of this?
Yes, I mean, when that assassination came through, it was big news. But it's not the first time that Russian generals have been attacked. Whilst it captured the news headlines, if you look at it from a strategic perspective, Russia has got lots of generals. This will not affect the war at all. I think what it does do is it's part of Ukraine's strategy to demonstrate that they can take the war to Russia. Russia isn't in complete control. What Russia is trying to do is to keep the war in Ukraine's boundaries so that Muscovites and those people in Russia can get on with their day-to-day lives and just listen to the news and hear tales of fancy of what's going on. By targeting Russian generals on the ground, by closing down the Russian airports, by targeting Russian oil supplies, refineries, and key airfields, what Ukraine is very effectively doing is demonstrating to the Russian population that President Putin is not in control, that he is fighting a war, and that Ukraine is capable of fighting back. But I wouldn't want to read too much into the loss of one Russian general. It is of concern for Russian forces, but quite bluntly, in an autocratic regime, as in Russia, President Putin has a lot of disposable generals. He will not miss a beat just because he loses one or two to assassinations.
Let's cover also, you just mentioned about Vladimir Putin. It's 25 years of Vladimir Putin's rule, and Russian propaganda channels have produced this big documentary about Vladimir Putin. He was showing journalists his flat in Kremlin. It's interesting that there weren't any kind of windows in his flat. Did you see this film, and what is your impression of this demonstration of Putin's main achievements?
I deliberately didn't watch that, Daniel, because I am not the target audience for that film. The target audience was the domestic Russian audience. And I think what's telling is under normal times, Putin would never do that sort of documentary, that sort of film. I think what's very clear is that if you remember, Yevgeny Prigozhin led that march against Moscow, and it was quite surprising how far he got. President Putin will be worried that as the death rate starts to rise, as more and more Russian soldiers go back home with bad injuries and tell the story about what's actually going on the front line, not what you're reading about, but what's actually going on, that does create a very different atmosphere in Russia. And the danger is Putin will believe that people will turn against him. So the more he can do to demonstrate that he is a long-term leader, that he's Mr. Security, that he cares for Russia, that he only has Russia's long-term interests at heart, and that he's painting this as an existential threat to the Russian way of life, this is all part of him trying to secure the support of his domestic audience. It's got nothing to do with what's actually going on, and everything to do with trying to bolster President Putin's popularity back at home so that he doesn't suffer the end, as so many dictators before him suffer, a very ignominious and a very swift end. He's very keen to avoid that.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian military intelligence has shot down two Russia's Su-30 fighter jets using maritime drones for the first time in the history of modern warfare. How can you assess this innovative way to destroy enemy's aircraft?
I think this is a fascinating story because it creates more questions than answers. It is the Maruva B7, I think it is, your maritime drone. It's not particularly big, it's very fast, it's normally packed full of explosives and driven towards Russian ships and explode on impact. On this particular occasion, it had a couple of missiles loaded onto it. Originally, these would have been former Russian or Ukrainian missiles, but actually it appears this time they were Sidewinder missiles, which are provided by the West. They're an air-to-air missile. They're infrared guided. In other words, unlike a radar missile that has to send out a signal to find where the enemy aircraft is, and therefore the enemy aircraft knows this missile is coming. With something like the Sidewinder, it's purely picking up the heat signature of the engine of the aircraft. The aircraft doesn't know the missile is coming at it, and therefore it can be very successful. But how on earth, when I used to fire Sidewinder missiles, we would fire one of those every 2 years to make sure we understood how it worked, how difficult it was to aim. You had to have the aircraft really steady. You had to put the tracking mechanism onto the target aircraft. You had to listen for a tone when the missile locked onto the target, and then you would press the trigger and fire the missile off. Well, last time I saw these maritime drones, they're bouncing along on the water like mad. So it's very difficult to provide a stable sighting situation for these missiles. Also, when they come off the rails of a military jet, you're already doing 400 miles an hour, so they're already flying. If you're now throwing them off a small maritime drone, how on earth do they get flying speed? How do they pick up the target? So I think there's lots of questions here, but without a doubt, this is a really good example of two Su-30 Russian aircraft were apparently shot down. One of the crews was killed, one of the crews survived. And this is a really good example of Ukraine using asymmetric technology, using innovation, using surprise, using deception to create some opportunities to shoot down state-of-the-art Russian aircraft. And I believe it's not the first time they've done this. They've done it with a helicopter as well, but it will certainly have left Russia wondering which way to turn and how on earth it guarantees the security of its very, very valuable fighter jets.
Let's cover our final topic. I just wanted to cover with you the air battle between India and Pakistan. According to CNN, a dogfight between Pakistani and Indian Air Force has occurred, and more than 100 fighter jets participated in this fight, which could be the longest and the largest such dogfight in the history of modern aviation. What is your take on this story from your personal experience?
Yeah, again, Daniel, I've been involved in Royal Air Force and air power for most of my lifetime. There are so many bits of this story that don't quite sit comfortably with me. First of all, the targets that were struck by India are all relatively close to the border. And if you were wanting to have an effect on the ground, you would use long-range missiles, and your fighter jets would never need to go anywhere near Pakistani airspace or Pakistani-controlled Kashmir airspace. So why you would risk your aircraft by pushing them into that space, I do not know. I would understand why you might put drones into that airspace to help identify the targets, to choose the best time and place to fire those long-range missiles. But originally, Pakistan claimed they had shot down 5 Indian Air Force jets. There's no proof of that at the moment. More and more information is coming out. But at its heart, let's be clear here, this is 2 nuclear powers, both of which believe that Kashmir is theirs. Let's not forget China is also administers part of Kashmir. But those 2 nuclear powers absolutely do not want to escalate to a nuclear war. It's almost certain that they would only use nuclear weapons if their very nations became threatened. So this is about the attack that Indian folks, that India believes that Pakistan sponsored the terrorists. India is therefore punishing Pakistan for doing that. But the language around all of this was very measured, and I was very struck by the Pakistanis going, okay, the international community was saying, what are you going to do next? How are you going to retaliate? And their language was much more, look, we pay a big price for this. We shot down 5 of their fighter jets. I think we don't need to do any more. All of that language, whether they do or they don't, it's all language that's trying to de-escalate the situation. Both sides have demonstrated their willingness to respond if the other does something, but neither side wants to see this escalate to any full confrontation.
And it seems like US President Trump doesn't really care much about the situation. The US were not involved in such big diplomatic efforts to end this conflict. Do you feel that as a sign that the US is walking away from the international stage?
I don't know. If I was part of President Trump's team, he's made lots of promises about bringing peace to the war in Ukraine, and he's done nothing. He's told about bringing Hamas and bringing the war to an end with Israel, bluntly, Israel's back on the front foot and now appears to have plans to occupy Gaza permanently. I think President Trump is going to be a little bit more careful about making promises about what he can achieve and then not being able to deliver. And I think at the moment, his advisors almost certainly are telling him, look, ever since 1947 and the partition of India at the end of the Second World War, there has been unrest around Kashmir. There will always be fighting unless that situation is resolved once and for all. But you don't need to get involved, America. Both sides do not want to see this escalate to nuclear war. The language on both sides seems to be restricting it. So the advice would be, why would President Trump want to get involved? Just steer well clear for now. Keep an eye on what's going on and only keep your powder dry because you might need to use it later on.
Thank you, Sean, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.